The first chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop begins not with a building, but with a necessity. Long before the sprawling Gothic spires of Yharnam were choked by the beastly scourge, the foundation of the workshop was laid in the shadows of Byrgenwerth. The lore of the workshop's origin is the lore of the primitive necessity. As the scholars of the Academy, led by Master Willem and the ambitious Lawrence, began to experiment with the old blood found in the Themerian labyrinths, the side effects became impossible to ignore. Men were changing. The beast within was clawing its way to the surface. To manage this biological leakage, a specialist was required, Gehrman, the first hunter. The purpose of the original workshop was the tactical containment of the secret. It was never intended to be a public institution. It was a black ops shed designed to clean up the scholar's mistakes before the public could sense the rot. The lore of the first tools reveals that Gehrman did not have the luxury of established martial tradition. He had to invent a way to kill things that were no longer human. This led to the creation of the burial blade, the masterpiece of the early workshop. Forged from siderite, a mineral said to have fallen from the heavens, the burial blade set the standard of the craft. Its purpose was efficient mercy. In these early days, the hunt was small-scale and intimate. Gehrman's hunters operated in the dead of night, wearing civilian clothes or simple hunter garb that didn't attract attention. The workshop's philosophy was the hunter as a ghost. They were the janitors of evolution, moving through the back alleys to erase the deformed. The rise of the workshop was the birth of the trick weapon, a tool that could adapt to the unpredictable anatomy of the beast. The physical location of the abandoned old workshop, hidden behind a secret path in the cathedral ward, provides insight into the geographic isolation of the era. The lore of the Sanctuary of the Sinners suggests that the workshop was placed in a liminal space, neither part of the church nor the city. This was the era of the hidden hand. Gehrman and his early apprentices, including the legendary Lady Maria, lived in a state of functional exile. Their purpose was to be used and forgotten. This reveals the disposable nature of the first hunters. They were the blades of Lawrence, tasked with the sorrowful work that allowed the healing church to maintain its holy image. The rise of the church's influence was built directly upon the quiet violence performed in this small wooden building. The relationship between the workshop and the doll offers a poignant look at the human cost of the craft. The lore suggests that the original doll was crafted by a lonely Gehrman after the departure or death of Lady Maria. This reveals the emotional insulation required to survive the workshop's history. To kill beasts night after night, the hunters needed a cradle, a place of softness amidst the cold steel. The workshop provided not just weapons, but a psychic anchor. This is the sanctity of the workbench. The rise of the workshop's technology was matched by the fall of the hunter's sanity. The doll represents the replacement of the human connection with a mechanical devotion. This established the workshop as a self-sustaining ecosystem of despair. Furthermore, the old hunter bone, found at the grave of the abandoned workshop, reveals the physiological price of the early techniques. Gehrman's art of quickening, the ability to move like a blur of discarded skin, was a sovereign secret. The lore of the art of the pulse suggests that the early workshop was obsessed with speed and precision over brute strength. Their purpose was to outpace the beast. They believed that if they were fast enough, they could kill the infection before it bite back. However, this quickening put an immense strain on the human frame. The fall of the first hunters was often a physical collapse. They were burning the candle at both ends to keep the darkness at bay. The lore of the workshop cord, the third umbilical cord found in the abandoned building, provides the eldritch connection to the history. It suggests that at some point, the human workshop was touched by a great one, the moon presence. The lore of the contract of the forge explains that Lawrence and Gehrman beckoned the moon to host the hunter's dream. This was the point of no return. The workshop moved from a physical place to a metaphysical state. The history of the building became the history of the nightmare. The purpose of the workshop shifted from containment to infinite resurrection. The rise of the hunter's dream was the eternal preservation of the workshop's function, long after its physical walls had rotted away. The act concludes with the silent abandonment of the original building. As the healing church grew more powerful, they created their own church workshop, led by Ludwig, rendering Gehrman's old ways obsolete. The lore of Part 1 establishes the original workshop as the tragic prototype. It was a school of slaughter that was discarded once the public hunt began. The hunter realizes that the first hunter was not a hero, but a pioneer of the grave. The rise of the workshop was the inauguration of the blood debt, a debt that would eventually drown the entire city. The legacy of the workshop's birth in this chapter is the horror of the hidden origin. We realize that the hunt was never about justice. It was about cleanup. The purpose of the workshop was to hide the mistake, and in doing so, it became the mistake itself. As the hunter stands in the dust of the abandoned workshop, they understand that the history of the blade is written in the blood of the betrayed. The second chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop marks the transition from the shadows to the spotlight, the era of the healing church workshop. As the beastly scourge grew beyond the containment capabilities of Gehrman's ghost hunters, the healing church realized that the hunt could no longer be a secret. It had to become a calamity managed by heroes. Enter Ludwig, the first hunter of the healing church. The lore of this era is the lore of the public executioner. Ludwig's purpose was to transform the workshop from a secretive guild into an industrialized military wing of the church. Under his guidance, the hunt was rebranded as a holy crusade. The purpose of the church workshop was the social mobilization of violence, inviting the common citizenry of Yharnam to take up arms and participate in their own purification. The lore of the Holy Blade reveals a radical shift in weapon design. While Gehrman favored the burial blade, a tool of subtle, reaping speed, Ludwig introduced the Ludwig's Holy Blade and the Kerkemer. These weapons were heavy, blunt, and radiant. Their purpose was ostentatious power. These tools were designed to be seen from the rooftops. They were symbols of authority as much as they were instruments of death. This era established the large-scale hunt. The church workshop's philosophy was that the beast should not just be evolved away, but crushed under the weight of righteous steel. The rise of Ludwig was the institutionalization of the bloodlust, where the hunter became a paladin and the workshop became an arsenal. The physical structure of the healing church workshop tower, looming over the cathedral ward, provides insight into the vertical hierarchy of the era. The lore of the ivory tower suggests that the workshop was no longer a shed in the woods, but a fortress in the sky. This was the era of the clergy hunter. Hunters were now given badges, the Sword Hunter Badge and the Radiant Sword Hunter Badge, to denote their rank and their divine right to kill. This reveals the bureaucracy of the blade. The church workshop became a place of standardization. They produced the repeating pistol and the church cannon, moving away from the artisan craft of Gehrman toward the mass production of firepower. The rise of the church's holy image was mirrored by the deafening roar of the workshop's artillery. The relationship between the church workshop and the Yharnam mob offers a dark look at the democratization of the scourge. Ludwig, in his noble simplicity, encouraged the people of Yharnam to defend themselves. This led to the creation of the saw cleaver and the hunter axe as mass-produced staples. The lore of the Citizen's Hunt explains that the workshop began to export its violence. They armed the tailors, the bakers, and the priests. This reveals the invasive purpose of the church workshop. It turned the entire city into a workshop extension. This was the era of the blood-drunk public. The rise of the civilian hunter was the beginning of the end, as the line between protector and beast began to blur in the red mist of the streets. Furthermore, the lore of the Holy Moonlight Sword provides the spiritual tragedy of this era. Found within the hunter's nightmare, the sword reveals that Ludwig's guidance was not from the church, but from a light only he could see. The lore of the guidance of the thread suggests that the workshop's holy weapons were a facade for a madness that Ludwig was desperately trying to suppress. His purpose was to remain human while performing monstrous acts. This reveals the psychological fragility of the church era. The workshop was building pedestals for men who were already rotting. The fall of Ludwig into the accursed horse was the final failure of the church's attempt to sanctify the slaughter. The lore of the powder kegs, the heretics of the workshop, represents the schism of philosophy during this time. While Ludwig wanted holy purity, the powder kegs wanted explosions. The lore of the late church divergence explains that the workshop eventually split. The mainstream, Ludwig's followers, stayed with the sword and the cross, while the fringe, the kegs, embraced the stake driver and the whirligig saw. This reveals the experimental anarchy of the industrial age. The workshop was throwing everything at the wall to see what would kill a beast faster. This was the era of the overkill. The purpose of the workshop had shifted from mercy to annihilation. The act concludes with the corruptive peak of the church workshop's history. As Ludwig disappeared and the cleric beasts began to emerge from the highest ranks of the church, the public realized that their heroes were the monsters. The lore of Part 2 establishes the healing church workshop as the gilded deception. It was an industrial machine that turned faith into frenzy. The hunter realizes that while Gehrman's workshop was sad, Ludwig's workshop was delusional. The rise of the Holy Blade was the fall of the city's soul. The legacy of the church workshop's expansion in this chapter is the horror of the badge. We realize that authority in Yharnam was just a license to slay. The purpose of the workshop was to give a name to the sin, and that name was holy. As the hunter stands before the grand cathedral, they understand that the history of the church is a history of the forge, where the fire was never divine, but only hotter. The third chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop turns toward the soot-stained workshop of the powder kegs. As the healing church workshop under Ludwig sought to refine the holy blade and the divine image, a splinter group of heretics emerged who found the church's methods too refined and their results too slow. These were the powder kegs, the mad scientists of the hunt. The lore of this era is the lore of the mechanical rebellion. Their purpose was to abandon the ethereal grace of Gehrman and the holy pretense of Ludwig in favor of raw, overwhelming force. The powder kegs believed that if a beast was an abomination of nature, it should be met with an abomination of technology. Their philosophy was simple. If a weapon ain't got a kick, it just ain't worth it. The lore of the heretic's forge reveals a fascination with the explosive and the complex. The powder kegs were responsible for the most technologically aggressive weapons in the hunter's arsenal. The stake driver, the rifle spear, and the whirligig saw. Their purpose was violent efficiency through combustion. Unlike the church, which relied on quicksilver bullets, which are infused with blood, the powder kegs obsessed over black powder and kinetic friction. This established the era of the mechanical beast hunter. Their tools were loud, heavy, and dangerous to the user. This reveals the self-destructive purpose of the kegs. They were willing to risk blowing themselves up if it meant taking a dozen beasts with them. The rise of the powder kegs was the invention of the overkill, turning the hunt into a war of attrition against the biology of the scourge. The physical remains of old Yharnam provide the most haunting insight into the totalitarian fire of the powder keg era. When the Ashen Blood Plague decimated the district, the healing church essentially gave the powder kegs free rein to solve the problem. The lore of the Great Burn suggests that the kegs did not just kill the beasts. They sanitized the entire city sector with fire. This was the era of the scorched earth. The purpose of the workshop here was purification through ash. The boom hammer and the Gatling gun were not tools of a surgeon, but of a demolition crew. This reveals the nihilistic philosophy of the group. They had lost faith in evolution or healing, and had placed their faith entirely in the Big Bang. The fall of old Yharnam was the ultimate masterpiece of the powder kegs. A city turned into a crematorium. The relationship between the powder kegs and the Jura, the retired hunter, offers a poignant look at the weight of the conscience. Jura was once a prominent member of this group, but the smell of burning fur and the screams of the innocent broke his spirit. The lore of the Protector of the Ash explains that Jura's eventual rebellion against the hunt was a direct reaction to the senselessness of the powder keg's purpose. He realized that the beasts were once people, and that the explosions were merely muffled cries. This reveals the ethical dead end of the workshop's history. The rise of the powder keg's technology led to a moral collapse so profound that their greatest practitioner became their greatest enemy. The workshop had become too good at killing. Furthermore, the lore of the whirligig saw, found in the hunter's nightmare, represents the industrial madness of the late powder keg period, described as a mechanical masterpiece that grinds beasts into mincemeat. The saw is a weapon of pure terror. The lore suggests that the kegs were fascinated by the sound of the hunt, the mechanical whirring that drowned out the growls. This was the psychological purpose of noise. By making the weapons louder and more complex, the hunters could distance themselves from the act of slaughter. They weren't killing a neighbor, they were operating a machine. The fall of the powder kegs was the rise of the automaton, where the hunter became just another gear in the clockwork of the nightmare. The lore of the Gatling gun and the cannon represents the defiance of the arcane. While the choir was looking at the stars and the church was looking at the blood, the powder kegs were looking at the foundry. They rejected the divine in favor of the dreadnought. Their purpose was to prove that human ingenuity could defeat eldritch ascension. This was the secular crusade. They wanted to blast the gods out of the sky with lead and iron. This reveals why the church eventually branded them as heretics. The kegs were too independent. They didn't need holy water. They needed grease and fuel. The rise of their heretical status was the only honor they ever truly wanted. The act concludes with the silent rusting of the keg's legacy. After the purge of old Yharnam, the church officially disbanded the group and buried their designs. The lore of Part 3 establishes the powder kegs as the explosive rebels of the workshop. They were the blacksmiths of the apocalypse, who believed that if the world was going to end, it should go out with a bang that the stars would feel. The hunter realizes that while Ludwig sought to save Yharnam and Gehrman sought to clean it, the powder kegs were the only ones honest enough to try and burn it. The legacy of the powder kegs in this chapter is the horror of the machine. We realize that progress in the workshop was a race to the bottom. The purpose of the workshop was to perfect the kill, and the kegs won that race at the cost of their humanity. As the hunter stands on the rafters of old Yharnam, looking down at the charred husks of the past, they understand that the history of the powder kegs is the history of the fuse, and the fuse has already run out. The fourth chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop ascends from the smoky foundries of the powder kegs to the silent, starlit heights of the upper cathedral ward. This is the era of the choir workshop, the most elite and secretive branch of the healing church's martial history. While Ludwig's men were soldiers and the powder kegs were engineers, the members of the choir were scholars of the edge. The lore of this era is the lore of the celestial refinement. Their purpose was to move the workshop away from the grit of the physical hunt and toward the grace of the arcane. The choir realized that as the beasts became more eldritch in nature, the steel of the past was becoming insufficient. Their purpose was the sanctification of the mind, turning the hunter's tool into a wand and the workshop into a laboratory of the stars. The lore of the astral blade reveals a fascination with celestial fluids and lumen. The choir was responsible for the transition of the workshop into arcane weaponry, most notably the threaded cane in its refined form and the rosmarinus. Their purpose was sublime efficiency through resonance. Unlike the mechanical clank of the powder kegs, the choir's tools were designed to sing. The rosmarinus, for instance, does not spray lead or fire. It sprays a mist of celestial fluid that resonates with the user's arcane stat. This established the era of the sophisticated slayer. The workshop's philosophy was that a hunter should not struggle with a beast. They should exorcise it with the voice of the cosmos. The rise of the choir workshop was the refinement of the slaughter, where the blood was replaced by light. The physical environment of the research hall and the astral clock tower provides the most haunting insight into the ethical transmutation of the choir era. Here, the workshop was used to probe the limits of the human brain. The lore of the fluid experiments suggests that the choir was obsessed with hearing the stars. This was the era of the inner eye. The purpose of the workshop here was evolutionary acceleration. They weren't just making guns. They were making mediums. The lock shield and the black sky eye, the proto-arcane tool, were developed in these halls. This reveals the cold, intellectual purpose of the group. They viewed the beast as a failure of physics that could be solved with mathematics and fluid dynamics. The fall of the research hall was the ultimate failure of the choir's logic, a place where knowledge turned into goo. The relationship between the choir workshop and Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower offers a poignant look at the aesthetics of the void. Though Maria was a student of Gehrman, she became the spiritual matriarch of the choir's martial philosophy. The lore of the Rikuyo's shadow explains that Maria rejected blood and embraced skill, a sentiment that the choir weaponized. They took her elegance and stripped it of its humanity. This reveals the vampiric nature of the choir's workshop. They stole the style of the first hunters and sterilized it for their own celestial rituals. The workshop had moved from protecting the city to observing the universe. The hunter was no longer a guardian. They were a laboratory assistant with a sword. Furthermore, the lore of the Holy Moonlight Sword, in its arcane form, represents the distant goal of the choir. While Ludwig used the physical blade, the choir studied the moonlight itself. They wanted to extract the light from the steel. This was the purpose of the intangible. By creating tools like the Augur of Ebrietas and a Call Beyond, the workshop essentially outgrew the need for a blade. They were turning the hunter's own body into the trick weapon. This reveals the terrifying ambition of the choir. They wanted to delete the workshop entirely and replace it with a god mind. The rise of the choir was the euthanasia of the martial, where fighting became a calculated result of insight. The lore of the blue elixir and the sedatives produced in this workshop represents the anesthetic purpose of the scholars. To see the stars, one must numb the earthly senses. The choir's workshop was the first to integrate pharmacology into the hunt. Their purpose was to make the hunter a vessel for celestial insight. This was the era of the chemical ascension. They didn't want strong hunters. They wanted silent receivers. This reveals why the choir was so quiet. They weren't just private. They were inert. The rise of their arcane dominance was the final silence of the workshop's human heart. The act concludes with the discovery of the cosmos in the orphanage. The celestial emissaries were the final product of the choir's workshop designs. The purpose had been achieved. They had turned man into Great One, or a poor imitation of it. The lore of Part 4 establishes the choir workshop as the cold peak of the hunt. It was a palace of glass that looked at the stars while the streets burned with beastly fire. The hunter realizes that while the powder kegs were angry and Ludwig was brave, the choir was simply indifferent. The legacy of the choir in this chapter is the horror of the distance. We realize that progress in the workshop led to a disconnection from the victim. The purpose of the workshop was to solve the universe, and they forgot to save the city. As the hunter stands at the top of the cathedral ward, looking at the cold, indifferent moon, they understand that the history of the choir is the history of the lens, a lens that magnifies the void and blinds the observer. This concludes Part 4 of the 10-part lore of the history of the hunter's workshop. We have explored the celestial refinement, the fluid experiments of the research hall, the aesthetics of the void under Maria, and the transition to the chemical godmind. The fifth chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the Hunter's Workshop explores a dark, foreign influence that bled into the Yharnam tradition, the Cainhurst Vilebloods. While the workshop was a product of Bergenworth's academia and the church's industry, the artisans of Castle Cainhurst developed a parallel martial history rooted in stagnant blood and aristocratic cruelty. The lore of this era is the lore of the sanguine corruption. The Vilebloods did not seek to cleanse or solve the scourge. They sought to refine it into a weapon of war. Their purpose was the elegance of the wound, and their influence forced the Yharnam workshop to adapt to a new kind of interhuman violence. The history of the Vileblood encroachment is the history of how the old blood was turned into liquid steel. The lore of the Bloodblade reveals a radical departure from the trick weapon mechanics of Gehrman. The Chickage, the signature weapon of the Cainhurst Royal Guard, introduced the concept of life force transmutation. Its purpose was lethality through self-harm. The blade, when sheathed, is standard steel. When drawn in its tricked state, it is painted with the user's own blood, gaining a corrosive crimson edge. This established the era of the sanguine duelist. The Cainhurst philosophy was that a weapon should be as high maintenance as the nobility itself. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the Vileblood tools. They require a tribute of life to function. The rise of the Chickage was the fall of the workshop's safety standards, proving that the most powerful blade is the one that hates its master. The physical design of the Evelyn pistol provides insight into the aesthetics of the hunt as a form of high art. Unlike the blunt utility of the Hunter pistol, the Evelyn is a long-barreled, ornate masterpiece. The lore of the Royal Ballistics suggests that for the Vilebloods, the kill had to be beautiful. This was the era of the romantic executioner. The purpose of the weapon was precision at a distance. By scaling with blood tinge rather than strength, the Evelyn rewarded those who had deepened their blood through the consumption of blood dregs. This reveals the predatory purpose of the Cainhurst lineage. They weren't hunting beasts for safety. They were hunting hunters to siphon their cold blood for the Annalise, queen of the Vilebloods. The relationship between the Vilebloods and the executioners, led by Martyr Logarius, offers a brutal look at the workshop's first civil war. The church could not tolerate a workshop that operated outside its holy control. The lore of the Bloody Siege explains that the executioners developed the Logarius wheel specifically to crush the Vileblood elegance. This reveals a reactionary purpose in workshop history. The wheel is a clunky, haunted slab of wood designed to batter the Chickage users into the earth. This was the era of the ideological meat grinder. The workshop was no longer fighting monsters. It was fighting itself. The fall of Cainhurst was the rise of the fanatical workshop, where holy purpose was used to justify genocide. Furthermore, the lore of the bloodletter, found in the Hunter's Nightmare, represents the extreme extension of the Vileblood philosophy. Used by the Bratter, the church's hidden assassin, the bloodletter is a mace that grows when plunged into the user's chest. This reveals the hypocrisy of the church workshop. While they condemned the Vilebloods as corrupt, they stole their blood magic to create their own secret police. The purpose of the bloodletter was internalized penance. It turned the hunter's guilt into a physical spike. This shows that the history of the workshop is a history of plagiarism. The church took the Cainhurst curse and rebranded it as holy punishment. The lore of the Vileblood hunter, the NPC Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, represents the end of the lineage. Standing in the Grand Cathedral, the crow is the ultimate evolution of the Vileblood encroachment. He uses the Chickage, Evelyn, and Old Hunter bone simultaneously. His purpose is sanguine supremacy. He proves that blood is the most potent of all the workshop's discoveries. This reveals the terminal truth of the workshop's evolution. If you fuel a blade with god blood, you create a god of slaughter. The rise of the Bloody Crow was the nightmare of the healing church, a mirror reflecting their own bloody foundation back at them. The act concludes with the silent cold of the Cainhurst ruins. Though the Vilebloods were purged, their DNA remained in the workshop. Every blood-tinged build and every sanguine tool is a ghost of the castle. The lore of Part 5 establishes the vile blood encroachment as the temptation of the Red River. It was the moment the workshop realized that the weapon was not outside the hunter, but inside their veins. The hunter realizes that while Ludwig offered light and Gehrman offered speed, the vile bloods offered intimacy with the pain. The legacy of the vile bloods in this chapter is the horror of the heritage. We realize that nobility in Yharnam was just a prettier mask for the scourge. The purpose of the workshop was to control the blood, but the vile bloods taught the workshop to worship it. As the hunter wipes the corrosive blood from the chickage, they understand that the history of Cainhurst is the history of the stain, a stain that never washes out, no matter how much holy water the church pours over the blade. The 6th chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the Hunter's Workshop unearths the lost era of the Odo Workshop. While the Healing Church and the Powder Kegs dominate the records of the modern hunt, the Odo Workshop represents the pioneers of the elemental. Operating in the transitional period between Gehrman's early days and the industrialization of the church, the Odo artisans were the first to look beyond steel and blood to the power of atmospheric energy. The lore of this era is the lore of the captive storm. Their purpose was to find a cleaner and more efficient way to slay the great beasts that were beginning to manifest in the dark corners of the city. The Odo Workshop's history is the history of the first bolt, an attempt to electrify the nightmare and harness the static of the cosmos for the edge of a blade. The lore of the Morning Star reveals the Odo Workshop's greatest achievement, the Tonitrus. This weapon, a mace featuring iron coils that generate bolt damage when struck against its own housing, was a radical departure from traditional trick weapon mechanics. Its purpose was electrical transmutation of the blunt. The Odo forgers realized that certain kin of the Great Ones and the more advanced beasts possessed a biological vulnerability to lightning. This established the era of the elemental specialist. Unlike the Powder Kegs, who used explosions, which are messy and heat-based, the Odo Workshop sought surgical striking. Their philosophy was that a hunter should strike with the speed of a bolt and the weight of the thunder. The rise of the Tonitrus was the inauguration of the high-frequency hunt, where the vibration of the coil was used to shatter the beastly marrow. The physical design of the piercing rifle and the church pick, often associated with the old hunters who were contemporaries of the Odo era, provides insight into the geometric precision of their craft. The lore of the focus point suggests that the Odo Workshop was obsessed with bypassing the hide. This was the era of the penetrative strike. The purpose of their weapons was anti-armor utility. By creating the church pick, a weapon that combines the slash of a sword with the thrust of a pick, the Odo artisans provided the tools necessary to kill the titan-sized beasts that were immune to simple cleavers. This reveals the calculated purpose of the group. They weren't slayers. They were anatomical engineers. They looked for the weak point in the beast's skeleton and designed a bolt to find it. The relationship between the Odo Workshop and the dark beasts, such as Parl, offers a terrifying look at the inspiration of the adversary. The lore of the Sanguine Spark suggests that the Odo forgers did not invent bolt damage. They stole it from the blue sparks emitted by the beasts of the desert. This reveals a mimetic purpose in workshop history. The workshop was mirroring the monster to kill the monster. They observed that as a beast's fur became rancid and staticky, it began to emit life energy as blue light. The Odo Workshop's purpose was to distill that light into a mechanical vessel. This shows that the history of the workshop is a history of the parasite, where human technology only advances by feeding on the eldritch biology of the enemy. Furthermore, the lore of the bolt paper produced by the workshop represents the commoditization of the storm. While the Tonitrus was a permanent weapon, bolt paper allowed any hunter to taste the power of the Odo Workshop for a few fleeting moments. The lore of the synthetic spark explains that the workshop used resins and conductive salts to store the bolt. This was the era of the disposable power-up. The purpose was to democratized the element. They wanted every common hunter to have the strength of the thunder in their pocket. This reveals the mercenary spirit of the Odo era. They were the suppliers of the edge, ensuring that the hunt never stalled due to a lack of elemental advantage. The lore of the Spark Hunter badge, held by Archibald, a later student of the Odo traditions, represents the latter-day obsession with the bolt. Archibald was not a forger, but a scientist who became enamored with the sound of the spark. His purpose was sensory reconstruction. He wanted to recreate the dark beast through the workshop. This reveals the dangerous arc of the Odo influence. It started as a tool for safety and ended as a cult of the spark. The rise of Archibald's tiny Tinnitrus was the final act of the Odo lineage, a miniature god held in the palm of a man, proving that the workshop had successfully bottled the lightning of the nightmare. The act concludes with the silent obsolescence of the Odo workshop. As the healing church moved toward arcane, which is more celestial, and the powder kegs moved toward fire, which is more visceral, the bolt was largely forgotten. The lore of Part 6 establishes the Odo workshop as the forgotten conduit of the hunt. They were the electricians of the apocalypse, who believed that knowledge was a current that had to be grounded in iron. The hunter realizes that while Ludwig looked to the moon and Gehrman looked to the grave, the Odo forgers were the only ones brave enough to look at the lightning in the blood. The legacy of the Odo workshop in this chapter is the horror of the synthetic. We realize that progress meant replacing the natural with the mechanical arc. The purpose of the workshop was to capture the power of the god, and the Odo artisans were the first to succeed through circuits and coils. As the hunter feels the static rising on their skin from the Tinnitrus, they understand that the history of the Odo is the history of the shock, a shock that awakens the mind even as it charred the soul. The 7th chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop delves into the most intimate and dangerous side of the craft, pharmacology. While the other branches focused on the edge and the engine, the medics of the workshop were concerned with the maintenance of the vessel. They realized early on that a human body, no matter how well armed, was physically incapable of surviving a night of hunting without chemical assistance. The lore of this era is the lore of the liquid crutch. Their purpose was to develop a suite of blood-based consumables that would allow a hunter to ignore pain, regenerate tissue, and withstand the psychic static of the Great Ones. The history of the workshop's medical wing is the history of the physiological lie, where the hunter's health was bought at the cost of their sanity. The lore of the blood vial is the cornerstone of the entire workshop. The medics did not just find the blood, they refined it. Their purpose was rapid cellular regeneration. By processing the old blood of the church through various filtering mediums, the workshop created the vials that the hunter uses. This established the era of the immortal combatant. A hunter could suffer a mortal wound and be healed in seconds. This reveals the addictive purpose of the medical wing. They wanted to create a dependency on the hunt. The more a hunter was injured, the more blood they consumed, and the more blood they consumed, the closer they came to the beastly scourge. The rise of the blood vial was the fall of the natural recovery, turning the hunter into a vessel of stolen life. The physical development of the lead elixir provides insight into the tactical numbing of the workshop. Described as a thick, yellowish liquid that makes the skin as hard as lead, the elixir was a masterpiece of the workshop medics. The lore of the weight of the flesh suggests that the purpose of the elixir was momentary invulnerability. By temporarily petrifying the hunter's skin, the medics allowed them to trade blows with giant beasts. However, this came with the price of mobility. This reveals the mercenary logic of the workshop. They viewed the hunter's agility as a sacrifice worth making for power. This was the era of the unyielding wall. The workshop wasn't just fixing the hunter. They were altering the physics of the human body to suit the violent geometry of the night. The relationship between the medics and the sedatives, produced from thick human blood, offers a terrifying look at the psychic shielding of the hunt. As hunters began to encounter the Great Ones and the brain-suckers, they began to succumb to frenzy, a state where the brain overheats from forbidden knowledge. The lore of the chemical blindfold explains that the medics created sedatives to cloud the mind. Their purpose was strategic ignorance. They didn't want the hunter to understand the cosmos. They wanted them to ignore it. This reveals the control purpose of the medical wing. They were the keepers of the sanity. By numbing the insight, they ensured that the hunter remained a blunt instrument for the church, rather than a scholar of the void. Furthermore, the lore of the beast blood pellets represents the forbidden frontier of workshop pharmacology. These pellets, dried clumps of beast liver, grant the hunter the beasthood status. The lore of the internalized predator suggests that the medics eventually gave up on healing and embraced infestation. The purpose of the pellets was sympathetic resonance. They wanted the hunter to feel like a beast, to kill like a beast. This reveals the final betrayal of the workshop's medical history. They were no longer doctors. They were infection managers. They realized that the only way to win the hunt was to give in to the very scourge they were supposed to fight. The rise of the pellet-addicted hunter was the end of the human workshop. The lore of the antidote and the ashen blood plague represents the failure of the cure. In old Yharnam, the medics' attempts to treat the disease only made it evolve. The lore of the reactive poison explains that the antidotes were merely placebos in the face of the great burn. This was the era of the medical futility. The purpose of the workshop here was the illusion of hope. They distributed the tablets to keep the public quiet, while the powder kegs prepared the fire. This reveals the political purpose of the medical wing. They were the propaganda of the healing church, using science to hide the Holocaust. The act concludes with the medical ruin of the Iosefka's clinic. As the real Iosefka was replaced by a choir impostor, the medic's workshop became a butcher's shop for celestial transformation. The vials were no longer for healing, they were for harvesting. The lore of Part 7 establishes the medics of the workshop as the chemists of the damned. They were the dealers of the old blood, who believed that survival was a formula that could be solved. The hunter realizes that while the blade was the hand, the vial was the chain. The legacy of the medics in this chapter is the horror of the dependency. We realize that healing in Yharnam was just another form of infection. The purpose of the workshop was to keep the hunter standing, no matter how broken their soul had become. As the hunter crushes a blood vial in their hand, feeling the icy rush of the old blood, they understand that the history of the medics is the history of the needle, a needle that sows the wound but poisons the heart. The 8th chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop unearths the metaphysical hardening of the craft, the discovery and utilization of blood gems. As the night of the hunt progressed and the beasts grew into titanic, eldritch horrors, the physical steel of the forge reached its limit. No matter how sharp the blade or how heavy the hammer, the material world was failing against the nightmare world. The lore of this era is the lore of the crystalline infusion. The workshop's purpose shifted from shaping metal to altering the essence. By harvesting the calcified blood found in the Themerian labyrinths, the workshop discovered they could imbue a weapon with a will of its own. The history of the blood gem is the history of the spiritual weapon, where the soul of the hunter and the echoes of the dead were fused into the very atoms of the sword. The lore of the Blood Gem Workshop tool reveals that this was an advanced integration. The tool, found in a chest in the central Yharnam district, allowed the hunter to slot these crystals into their trick weapons. Their purpose was anatomical specialization. Different gems, radial, triangular, and wand, allowed the workshop to fine-tune a weapon's behavior. A simple saw cleaver could be transformed into a firebrand or a bolt striker without changing its physical shape. This established the era of the fluid forge. The workshop's philosophy was that the weapon should be as malleable as the dream. This reveals the adaptation purpose of the late-stage workshop. They realized the hunt was an evolutionary race, and the blood gems were the mutations that allowed the hunter to stay ahead. The physical nature of the gems, described as droplets of blood that have hardened into stone, provides insight into the geological sorrow of the labyrinth. The lore of the calcified grief suggests that these gems are not natural minerals. They are the condensed will of the Pthumerian ancestors. When a hunter slots a gem into their blade, they are invoking the dead. The purpose of the gem was ancestral borrowing. By using a cursed or dirty gem, the hunter gained immense power at the cost of their vitality or durability. This reveals the sacrificial logic of the workshop's peak. They were willing to curse the weapon if it meant killing the god. This was the era of the desperate power, where the workshop began to gamble with the spirit to save the flesh. The relationship between the blood gems and the winter lanterns, the brain-headed singing monsters, offers a terrifying look at the sourcing of the spirit. The most powerful droplet gems are found on these entities. The lore of the Song of the Stone explains that the gems absorb the frenzy of the environment. This reveals the psychic sponge purpose of the workshop's materials. The workshop was harvesting madness to increase lethality. This shows that the history of the workshop is a history of the void, where the tools became darker the closer they got to the heart of the nightmare. The rise of the gems was the death of the blacksmith, as the forge was replaced by the sacrificial altar. Furthermore, the lore of the blood rock represents the absolute limit of the craft. Only one or two of these exist in the waking world. It is a stone that links the worlds. The purpose of the blood rock was the final tempering. It represents the moment a weapon ceases to be a tool and becomes a part of the Great One. A +10 weapon is no longer made of iron. It is made of intent. This reveals the ascension purpose of the workshop. They wanted to elevate the sword to the status of a Great One so that it could slay a Great One. This turns the history of the workshop into a theological war, where the hammers are holy relics and the hunters are high priests of the grindstone. The lore of the tear stone, given by the doll, represents the emotional imprinting of the gems. A small, silver-gray stone that glows with a faint warmth. This reveals that the workshop could capture more than just violence. It could capture empathy. The purpose of the tear stone was the comfort of the cold. It provided healing to the hunter not through blood, but through memory. This shows the dual nature of the gem era. It was a tomb for rage, but also a locket for love. The rise of the hunter's power through these stones was the final testament of the workshop's humanity, buried deep within the mineral heart of the blade. The act concludes with the silent pulsing of the weapon slots. As the hunter looks at the crimson glow emanating from their kerchimer, they realize that the steel is breathing. The lore of Part 8 establishes the blood gems as the ghost in the machine of the workshop. They were the fuel of the nightmare turned into the edge of the hero. The hunter realizes that the workshop did not just make weapons, it trapped souls. The legacy of the blood gems in this chapter is the horror of the permanent mark. We realize that improving a weapon meant corrupting it with the dead. The purpose of the workshop was to perfect the spirit of the kill, and they found that spirit in the graveyards of the deep. As the hunter feels the cold vibration of the cursed gem against their palm, they understand that the history of the gems is the history of the echo, an echo that screams every time the blade finds bone. The 9th chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop uncovers the internal security of the hunt, the tools of censorship and erasure. As the workshop expanded into different factions, the powder kegs, the choir, and the executioners, the risk of information leakage and ideological rebellion became a threat to the healing church's hegemony. The lore of this era is the lore of the redacted knight. The workshop's purpose was no longer just to kill beasts, but to kill the witness. By developing tools like the silencing blank and employing hidden hunters like Bratter, the workshop ensured that any hunter who saw too much or spoke too loud was quietly removed from the history books. The history of the workshop's shadow is the history of the controlled narrative, where the bell of cooperation was silenced by the blank of the void. The lore of the silencing blank reveals the metaphysical border control of the dream. This small, inconspicuous tool is used to disrupt the resonance between hunters, sending guests back to their own worlds. Its purpose was the prevention of unauthorized communion. In the early days, the workshop realized that if too many hunters shared insight, they might collectively realize the true nature of the Great Ones. This established the era of the isolated hunter. The workshop's philosophy was that the hunt must be a personal burden, not a political movement. This reveals the anti-revolutionary purpose of the late-stage workshop. They wanted to partition the reality. The silencing blank was the delete key for social cohesion, ensuring that every hunter felt alone in their madness. The physical existence of Bratter, the church assassin, provides insight into the extrajudicial enforcement of the workshop. Bratter wears the hide of a cleric beast that he himself slew, and he rings a sinister bell to invade and execute those who stray from the path. The lore of the hidden penance suggests that the workshop required a monster to kill monsters. Bratter's purpose was the maintenance of the secret. He was the workshop's silence personified. This reveals the cannibalistic logic of the church era. They were willing to turn their best hunters into caged murderers to ensure the lives of the choir remained protected. This was the era of the internal purge, where the workshop began to slay its own children to keep the grave of its history shallow. The relationship between the sinister bell and the bell-ringing woman offers a terrifying look at the automated hostility of the nightmare. Unlike the beckoning bell, which invites help, the sinister bell invites conflict. The lore of the competitive hunt explains that the workshop eventually embraced the bloodlust between hunters as a selection process. Their purpose was survival of the most violent. By allowing adversaries to invade one another, the workshop ensured that only the most corrupt or most lethal hunters would reach the higher tiers of the nightmare. This shows that the history of the workshop is a history of the arena, where the hunters were gladiators fighting for the amusement of the moon. Furthermore, the lore of the lead elixir, often used by those who hunt other hunters, represents the hardening of the heart. In the Shadow Workshop, the hunters stopped using light and started using weight. The purpose of the shadow tools was the suppression of the individual. By using the executioner's gloves or the black sky eye, the internal security hunters could snuff out a dissenter before they could even draw their blade. This reveals the technocratic tyranny of the workshop. They had perfected the kill to the point where assassination was a science. This turns the history of the workshop into a record of the disappeared, where the brightest minds of Bergenworth were extinguished by the dullest blades of the church. The lore of the underground cell key represents the physical manifestation of the silence. Beneath the research hall, the workshop kept its mistakes in small, dark rooms. The purpose of these cells was the quarantine of the truth. These were hunters who had learned the canticle of the Great Ones and could not be untaught. This reveals the cowardly purpose of the workshop's leadership. They couldn't solve the madness, so they locked it in the basement. This shows the dual failure of the workshop. It failed to save the city, and it failed to kill the doubt. The rise of the Shadow Hunters was the final admission that the hunt was a lie that required blood to keep it quiet. The act concludes with the silent echo of the old hunter bell. As the hunter rings the bell to summon help, they are unknowingly participating in the bureaucracy of the nightmare. Every summon and every silence is tracked by the workshop's shadow. The lore of Part 9 establishes the silencing blank as the ultimate weapon of the hierarchy. It was not a tool of war, but a tool of control. The hunter realizes that the workshop did not just forge blades. It forged ignorance. The legacy of the Shadow Workshop in this chapter is the horror of the missing voice. we realize that the history we are following is only the approved history. The purpose of the workshop was to curate the reality, and they deleted the dissenters to make the lie look like destiny. As the hunter uses the silencing blank to banish an adversary, they understand that the history of the silence is the history of the coward, a coward who hides the blood behind a bell that does not ring. The final chapter in our 10-part investigation into the history of the hunter's workshop brings us back to where the night began, the hunter's dream. This is the lore of the metaphysical workshop, the version of the forge that exists beyond the reach of fire, time, and the physical rot of Yharnam. While the previous 9 chapters explored the material history, the blood, the steam, and the shadow, this final part explores the celestial purpose. The dream is the ultimate evolution of the workshop. It is no longer a building of wood and stone. It is a psychic construct sustained by the moon presence. The history of the dream is the history of the workshop as a trap, where the art of the hunt was preserved at the cost of the hunter's freedom. The lore of the workshop's transcendence reveals that the dream was created as a perfect simulation. Its purpose was the preservation of the methodology. When the real workshop in the waking world was burned or abandoned, the Great Ones uploaded its essence into the dream. This established the era of the immortal smithy. In the dream, the weapons never rust, the blood never dries, and the workbench is always ready. This reveals the strategic purpose of the moon presence. She needed a stable environment to train her surrogates. The dream is the virtual training ground of the apocalypse. The rise of the dream was the death of the physical workshop, turning the history of the blade into a looping nightmare. The physical presence of Gehrman, the first hunter, in the dream provides the most tragic insight into the human battery of the craft. Gehrman is not the master of the dream. He is its host. The lore of the shackled apprentice suggests that the workshop required a human anchor to function. Gehrman's purpose was the maintenance of the memory. He is the living blueprint. By keeping Gehrman trapped in the wheelchair, the moon presence ensures that the knowledge of the hunt remains accessible to every new blood-slicked visitor. This reveals the parasitic nature of the final workshop. It feeds on the grief and skill of the old guard to fuel the new generation. The workshop is a perpetual motion machine of trauma. The relationship between the plain doll and the workshop tools offers a look at the deification of the craft. In the waking world, the doll was an empty vessel, but in the dream, she is the conduit of the echoes. The lore of the transmutation of the spirit explains that the workshop moved from sharpening steel to sharpening the soul. When the hunter channels their blood echoes through the doll, they are merging with the workshop. This was the era of the biological weapon. The hunter is the trick weapon. This reveals the final evolution of the workshop's history. It successfully erased the boundary between the hunter and the tool. The rise of the hunter god, part 17 of our previous cycle, is the ultimate goal of the workshop's design. Furthermore, the lore of the pillars of stone, the massive columns seen in the distance of the dream, represents the infinite iteration of the workshop. The lore suggests that there are many dreams and many workshops. The purpose of the pillars was redundancy. The Great Ones have parallel processed the hunt across countless timelines. This reveals the universal purpose of the workshop. It is a cosmic standard. Wherever there is a moon, there is a workshop. Wherever there is blood, there is a blade. This turns the history of the workshop into a mathematical certainty, where the hunt is a law of physics rather than a local event. The lore of the burial blade in the final encounter with Gehrman represents the closing of the circle. Gehrman uses the first weapon to finish the job. Its purpose in the dream is the mercy of the release. By slaying the hunter, Gehrman awakens them from the dream. This reveals the merciful failure of the workshop. Its final gift is the ability to forget. However, if the hunter resists and defeats Gehrman, they inherit the wheelchair. This shows the vicious cycle of the history. The workshop always demands a master. It is a sovereignty of the suffering. The act concludes with the burning of the workshop in the dream's final phase. As the flowers catch fire and the building glows red, the physical image of the workshop is finally destroyed. The lore of Part 10 establishes the hunter's dream as the dissolving of the ego into the stars. The workshop was never about the steel. It was about the ascension. The hunter realizes that the workshop was a cocoon, and the hunt was the process of breaking out. The legacy of the workshop in this final chapter is the horror of the infinite. We realize that history was just a carousel designed to produce a god. The purpose of the workshop was to perfect the hunter, and once perfected, the workshop is redundant. As the hunter looks at the burning embers of the dream's workbench, they understand that the history of the workshop is the history of the fire, a fire that consumes the maker to illuminate the result.